We are live. In today's episode, we'll dive up into how AI is accelerating product market fit collapse. I came across a Reforge article on product market fit collapse. It's a term that was likely coined by the author Brian Balfour, who is the co-founder and CEO of Forge. And this specific article was written in collaboration with two other people in the product community, Casey Winters and then Fareed Masawat. But this is not a new concept. Once a company hits product market fit, it's a milestone. It's not the end of the product life cycle because as new companies are evolving, as customer expectations are changing, it is bound to happen that another company finds their product market fit, which results in the collapse of existing companies. But what was interesting, AI is making this collab happen much faster than it has in the previous decades. And instead of a gradual linear decline, it results in an exponential shift. So that piece really got me excited, which is how AI is reshaping entire industries at an unusual fast speed. And I believe this is a result of customer expectations changing as well as innovation happening at a crazy fast speed. There's like many concepts like you have AI development tools, agents, you have RAG models and whatnot. So there's a lot that's available that has lowered the barrier to entry, the barrier to innovate, along with expectation changing by customers. I think this is an exciting topic for us. And I know you've done some research on specific companies, so we want to dive into it.
Yeah. Different technologies usher in revolutions and they disrupt business models. But the unique thing with generative AI is that the speed of the change, like the speed of the disruption, is really unprecedented. And I think it will be useful to first look at it from like a 30,000-foot view at a macroscopic level. And I found this really nice research report from Deloitte. I'm going to quickly bring up my screen because one of the graphics that they created is fascinating. This is from research done by Deloitte for the Australian market, but it translates really well for the North American market as well, and globally, in fact. And what they've done is they have taken this disruption that generative AI is causing, and they have tried to predict how it's going to affect different industries. They have this concept of short fuse versus long fuse and the size of the bang. Essentially, what they're trying to say is a short fuse is that this disruption is going to happen quickly. This is going to happen all of a sudden. And with the long fuse is that it's going to be a disruption, but it's going to be gradual. The other property here is like the size of the bang, how much it's going to disrupt these business models in these industries. They've categorized it into small bang and big bang, which is really self-explanatory. What's interesting is that this research was done in 2023. So now that we're in like early 2025, this is a great time to back up on these predictions. How is it going? What I was surprised to find is it's pretty spot on, actually. You see here on the graph that industries like education, professional services had been predicted to be disrupted quite significantly. And that's what we're seeing now. In the education space, take the example of language learning, Duolingo. When ChatGPT first launched and went viral, Duolingo had a significant drop in its stock. And then when they released ChatGPT 4, their multimodal model, again, there was like a 3% drop in stock immediately. And we're seeing the same with professional services. Companies like Fiverr and Upwork are seeing a drop in traffic, which is pretty obvious because a lot of the freelance work can now be automated and people can use generative AI instead of outsourcing it to freelancers, especially the short little tasks. And I think now here in 2025, we can see a lot of initial disruptions in the industries that are on the right side here as well. Administrative support services. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff going on in health, but down here, even though they predicted a smaller bang, the arts and design has a lot of companies that are struggling to keep up with this wave of generative AI tools that are flooding the market. It's a really interesting graph to get that high level view of how this AI, generative AI technology is sweeping the global economy and touching different industries at different times and at different sizes. So
As you were reading this report, like, does the report talk about why different industries will see a change in different time horizons? And I know I've looked at this before when you shared for the first time, but one question that comes to my mind is like, why does Deloitte expect real estate to see a change in close to 2026, 2027, as opposed to financial services that will say adoption of AI uh, early on?
So, no, I didn't actually read further. This graph is the thing that I found first, and then I searched for the report. And so I'm pretty sure like that would be an interesting read. So I'm looking forward to like going through the full report. But we can think about some of these critically and it makes sense. Like government services, they're very risk averse and they don't like to play around with or play fast and loose with data. Some of those seem pretty obvious, but others, yeah, I'm not sure. But it'll be good to go through this report and circle back and see why these predictions were made. But that gives us a good idea of the generative AI disruption in general. All right, we talked about disruption and PMF collapse, and that's definitely interesting, and everybody's talking about that. But I think when doing some research on this for our episode today, what I found even more interesting is the way companies are responding. And it's fascinating the moves that they're making and how they're navigating these choppy waters created by generative AI. And I think that's what we're really trying to talk about today.
Yeah, it's about how companies are adopting or not adopting and what's the consequence of that. The bottom line is that you can't ignore this trend that's happening. So every company has to reevaluate.
Yeah, for sure. And we're going to talk about the learnings and the lessons that we gained from the research that we did for this episode and the cases that we want to talk about. But you touched upon an important one, and that is anybody who thinks that AI is not inevitable, that it's not going to disrupt literally every industry eventually, will lose out in the end. Because I think it's pretty clear to everybody by now that it's here to stay. And we want to talk about how companies are responding to generative AI. And I found this fascinating example in the stock photography industry. And the two giants in that space are Shutterstock and Getty Images. And it was really interesting the way they approached this. And they each approached it in a slightly different way. And I took some time to create a timeline of everything that happened during this time. And let's talk about the key events. And I want to preface this by saying that it's easy to look at things in hindsight. So it's easy to think that there were some unfortunate decisions made, but I don't think that's the right way to look at this. Each of these companies has some very talented people and very, very capable leaders, and they made the best decisions that they could with whatever information that they had. And it's never easy to predict the future, but they each predicted the future in slightly different ways. And I think that made the big difference because they made little different bets and they made them at slightly different times. So that's my first big preface, that this is not to say that one company was more talented than the other or had better or more experienced people than the other, but rather it's about talking about the vision that they each had for the future, how they took all the data that they had in front of them and tried to predict the future and how that affected the outcome. So it's probably useful to first start off with how the disruption started. So OpenAI's DALL-E model was released in January 21. So it's 2020, early 2021, DALL-E comes out. It's not that great. It doesn't seem like it's going to disrupt stock photography, which is generally about like very professional images and high quality images. But then like a year or so later in April 2022, DALL-E 2 was released. And then in that same year, 2022, there were other releases who are now the big players in the space, Midjourney, and the other one is Stable Diffusion. So these different tools and models that launched during this time, when they launched, it became pretty clear that it's going to have a big impact on stock, right? And it was pretty clear by the second half of 2022 that the players in the space, Shutterstock, Getty Images, they both needed to respond. And they each responded in slightly different ways. It started with Getty Images. In September of 2022, what they did was they banned all AI content from their platform. So Getty Images' initial response um, was to fight back against the trend. And they decided that first thing that they're going to do is they're going to ban the stuff, like try to keep it away from them as much as possible. And at the same time, they did start using AI, but they used AI for editing images. So they had a partnership with a company, and they started creating this tool that would help them edit images. But around the same time, October 2022, Shutterstock had a very different response, and they decided to jump onto the trend. They wanted to adopt AI, and they saw it, from what I read, it felt like they saw it as an opportunity. And they tried to frame it in terms of, okay, this is going to disrupt us, but it's also an opportunity. What can we do? What can we do with this? And so they announced that they would partner with OpenAI and they would use DALL-E to create their own image generation tool. So they wanted to use these base models and create a tool out of it. And they did it in a really interesting way because they knew that they weren't going to compete just with DALL-E or Stable Diffusion or Midjourney by providing another like chatbot image generation product. So they built a whole application where you could decide what you wanted. You could select the type of image. It could be like a true to life kind of image or an animated image. They had these different types of images you could select and various other features. So their play was UX, and at the same time, you could connect multiple models. So they used multiple models in the back end to generate that image for you. So as a user, it seemed pretty obvious what value they were going for. But the key difference here between Shutterstock and Getty around this time is that they're approaching it in different ways. Getty is looking at it from a risk perspective and thinking this is going to disrupt us and we have to push back. And Shutterstock, it seemed like, was adopting it a little more actively. So that was, I think, a very interesting phase here. And I also want to say that the whole LLM craze was yet to come at this time. ChatGPT's release was November 2022. So this whole AI image generation prefaced all of the LLM related disruption. So that's another reason I really liked reading about this, because these were the companies that were one of the first to get disrupted by generative AI even before ChatGPT and LLM came into the picture.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting is the adoption of AI by consumers has also changed. When ChatGPT was released, they acquired like 100 million customers, I believe, in the matter of weeks, which was an extremely fast growth. So,
Yeah, and you can see from the timeline, the adoption was pretty quick. Like a new technology comes into the market in April of the year, and by September, the biggest players in the industry are responding to it by making some pretty major changes to their business model and their partnerships. So it was, again, pretty much all of a sudden. But ChatGPT launched in November 2022. That didn't really affect this space so much. But by Jan of the next year, January 2023, Shutterstock launched it. They launched their AI generative image gen product in partnership with OpenAI. And an announcement coming in October and the tool is ready by January it also seems pretty unprecedented. And the speed at which these companies are responding to it was quite impressive to see. But January 2023, Shutterstock has released their generative AI tool, and in February 2023, images sued Stable Diffusion. So see the contrast. How Shutterstock's kind of at this stage in the game adopting AI and releasing products using the technology, whereas Getty Images is still trying to think about it in terms of risk, and they're pushing back and they're suing companies, which is valid. I don't want to say that the lawsuits and everything didn't hold weight, because it's a big topic of discussion now, how these models have been trained and what data has been used, what proprietary data has been used. So I'm not too sure of what the outcome for that lawsuit was, but I'm just trying to highlight like the approach was very different. And I want to go back to what I said a little bit earlier about the difference was probably coming back from the vision of the future. And the way I read it, it seemed like Shutterstock's image of the future, the vision that their leadership had, pretty much saw AI as inevitable, and they kind of framed it as an opportunity. So instead of pushing back, they said, yeah, this is going to come disrupt us. We want to adopt it, but what are the challenges to adopting that? And both of these companies were well aware of the legal risks that these AI products, the legal risks that these AI products brought with them. And that was around how do you make it commercially safe that a customer using AI generated stock image does not get sued by a photographer or an image creator that sees that image as very similar to an image that they shot. So they saw the legal hurdles and both of them were aware of it. But I saw Shutterstock seeing it as a challenge to overcome and then thinking about solutions. Whereas at that stage, Getty Images, the vision that I felt from them was that they saw significant legal hurdles and they saw that any company that's going to use this technology is going to run into significant legal troubles in the future. And so it's probably best to stay away.
Yeah, that's very tricky in the current space because like the whole idea which we introduced was the product market fit collapse is happening at a much faster rate. Is that yes, you may pick a different direction than your competitor, but it's changing so quickly that you may not be able to evaluate what the competition is doing and what results do they see.
You're right. There was a significant difference in outcome. So we're now at February 2023. Getty Images has sued Stable Diffusion, but by September 2023, Getty Images hopped on board the generative AI image generation train. They finally caved and they launched a partnership with NVIDIA for a product, and it was simply called Generative AI by Getty Images. Not a very creative name, but I think they did it well. Once they hopped on the bandwagon, I think they did sort of hit the ground running. And I don't know if that translated into actual revenue for them or anything. From what I read, the approach that they had was to create a very, very commercially safe product and a product that compensates photographers in some way. But obviously Shutterstock did this first. Shutterstock launched their AI product and they started selling licenses to their tool and people could generate AI generated images. So they came up with a pretty interesting model to compensate photographers by creating what they called a contributor fund. So if, first of all, they wanted to make it commercially safe in the sense that all training that was done for Shutterstock's product was done using their own database of images. So they had complete access and complete legal right to use that content to train their models. And the way they compensated the work that was used to train their models was by creating this contributor fund. Whenever, and I guess whenever an image was generated that had used training from a photographer, that photographer would be compensated in some way using the fund. And they dispersed like millions of dollars through that contributor fund to photographers. So they did a good job of overcoming those obstacles that they foresaw and those legal troubles by actually addressing them with a product that took those legal concerns into consideration. When Getty Images launched their AI product, and they also addressed the legal concerns pretty well. And from what I read, they had an extreme focus on making sure that they didn't run into any legal troubles. And they did it in pretty smart ways. And we're going to share all the links and resources along with this podcast so people can read further if they're interested. But basically the way Getty Images did was that they would compensate based on the amount of images used in that training data by an individual. So a photographer, if they have contributed more to the training data, they would get compensated a little bit more. And none of these companies obviously could create a model in which at the time an AI image is generated, it can identify whose photographs were used in the training that enabled the generation of that one photograph. Like that's impossible. So they both came up with like creative ways to compensate photographers. And the bottom line is, yeah, by September 2023, both Shutterstock and Getty Images had AI generated images as part of their offerings. And then the outcome was that by June 2024, Shutterstock declared over $100 million in revenue generated from their AI licensing. So just being early to the market with their product um, got them like a significant benefit in terms of actual bottom line and actual revenue. So it was clear by like mid 2024, mid last year, Shutterstock's bet was paying off, and they were earning millions of dollars from the tool that they had created in partnership with OpenAI. And I believe it's just called simply Shutterstock.ai.
That's very interesting. They both understood the risk because there was mitigation to the risks outlined with the licensing, with images being used to train the AI models. But Shutterstock jumped on that bad bug quickly, but at the same time, they worked on addressing those licensing issues with compensating the artist to make sure that not only are they entering in this space, but they are building something that's sustainable. Whereas Getty Images had a more risk-averse reaction early on, but eventually they also joined and took advantage of AI with a product that was already addressing the risks that they would be taking on.
And these are not like young, mature companies that like have not like been there and done that in terms of handling changes to their industry. Getty Images was founded in 1997. It's close to what 30 years now. Shutterstock was founded in 2003, right? So that's over 20 years ago. So these companies have seen a lot of revolutions in their space, or a lot of disruptions, I should say, in their space. One of them was the smartphone revolution. People thought, or rather, the smartphone camera revolution, because people thought that the prevalence of cameras and the ease with which you can shoot high quality photos using your smartphones would disrupt these companies. But they survived that. And their business has lasted and stood the test of time. But as we're going to see, this AI revolution finally kind of did what nothing else, no other technology could do before, which was trigger consolidation in the industry. And just January of this year, January 2025, they announced a merger. So Shutterstock and Getty Images planning to become one company, and it's going to take them a few months. By the second half of this year, that merger should be complete. Shutterstock was doing pretty well. They had for 2024 about a 15% year-on-year growth in I think Q4. Getty Images in the same period had just a 2.5% year-on-year growth. So Shutterstock was doing really well. Traditionally, Getty Images is the bigger company. They generally have a slightly higher revenue. They've been around longer. They're the premium player in the space. They focus on like premium, high quality stock images from professional photographers that cost a lot. And Shutterstock was, I think, had their space in the market as the company which was perfect for these freelancers and small businesses. And they had a lot of free content on their website as well. But when the merger was announced, a good indication of which company was better off was the way the stock market reacted. So when the merger was announced, Getty Images shares shot up like 20%, where Shutterstock's went up, but they went up like 7.7%. So clearly in the merger, the stock market felt that Getty Images benefited a lot more from this merger than Shutterstock. So yeah, that's the story so far of Shutterstock and Getty Images and the way they have been handling this disruption caused by generative AI.
That's interesting. Okay, I didn't even realize that they're merging. I thought there was a joint venture that they came up with. They'll still be operating as independent companies, but they are like creating a product as one consolidated like entity. Not an apples to apples comparison, but I know when Venmo was starting in the US, you had banks like Chase coming up with their own like mobile payments. Bank of America had their own mobile payments. And then eventually what happened was these big banks got together and built Zelle, which was essentially mobile payments within the same banks, but also intra-bank. So the idea was that by coming together and building this same technology allowed them to be better positioned to compete against Venmo as opposed to each of these big banks competing with this new fintech company, Venmo. Sometimes this legacy companies who are competing with each other have to reevaluate their propositions based on the consumer trends, based on the advancements in technology, and see like how can they best react to it. And at times it's like Zelle is an example where the banks didn't really merge, but they invested into building a common platform. But with Getty Images and Shutterstock, it was a company just getting together and becoming one company, creating visual content for its creators.
Yeah, and each new technology that causes disruption requires different approaches from different companies. And that's what we're seeing now with generative AI. There's no one size fits all. There's no playbook. Everybody has to kind of figure out how it's going to disrupt them and make different kinds of bets and approach it in a way that's right for them. And I know you have a couple of examples that you looked into, and I'm pretty interested to hear about those stories.
One of the examples that I looked at was Stack Overflow, which engineers, developers would use. And that just gave them a library of code that they could read and understand before they start writing any piece of code. And it was all user generated. With the release of Gen AI tools like ChatGPT, but now even more AI development tools like Cursor, these engineers are going to these AI tools and getting ideas as opposed to going to Stack Overflow. And what they did very well was Stack Overflow and going in partnership with OpenAI, which I found very interesting because that allowed them to use their database of user generated content for many years. So they have millions of code, lines of code, if not billions, that they had in their repository. It's proprietary to Stack Overflow. And they're now using that to train the AI models. This is a good example of human generated content versus AI generated content. But by going into a partnership, it was a win win for both because you have data that you can use to train the AI models. I also know that Stack Overflow had different plugins, as well as for Microsoft Teams. My former company had that plugin where I could go into Stack Overflow to get feedback not only on my code, but I would use Cloud or ChatGPT for. Like it would do like I can use that as an editor for an email for my document. So they venture into this AI space just from a different angle, and that partnership was a smart idea from their end. I forget where this was from, but Stack Overflow website over the years, I've seen that traffic start to decline because people have Gen AI tools, but that traffic drip is not bad because Stack Overflow now has diversified their product offerings, which are hard to gauge just from the website visits that they would have.
That's really interesting. So it was pretty clear with Stack Overflow on how they could get disrupted. And you're saying that they also kind of approached this very proactively. And before it killed them, they adopted AI, got the partnerships going, and sort of went on board with the whole trend. Sounds very similar to the response by Shutterstock.
Yeah, and if we talk about the PMF collapse, which was the topic we introduced for this discussion, in that sense, Stack Overflow's original product has a tough competition. So their PMF was not as strong as it used to be. And by adopting, they're preparing to not be collapsed by uh, product market fit from other companies.
Yeah, and I think in contrast with the stock photography space, Stack Overflow is a contributor driven but free platform where people helped each other without any real benefit to themselves. So I see that as a difference. So I guess for Stack Overflow, there were less like legal risks to adopting AI. And their main goal was become a platform which would help people solve their coding issues. And so whether they do that through a community platform or they do that through AI, it still gets the job done.
Yeah, it's shifting from being a knowledge hub that was crowdsourced from different devs, and I would imagine that going through Stack Overflow and reading different files would take much longer than going to an LLM model or like a Gen AI tool. I would be getting faster answers and I could get faster answers with less inputs, right? Because the Gen AI tools eventually start learning. So I'm sure what that would have meant is a decline in their traffic because people are going to another tool, which is ChatGPT in this case, and then they realize that in order to diversify their revenue, in order to keep growing, they can start licensing their data to train the OpenAI models, and that creates another revenue stream for Stack Overflow. At the same time, finding ways where they can coexist together. Yeah, so this is a clear example of you're redefining, you're reevaluating your product market fit as a company that has been around for a long time.
Yeah, I wonder if product-led growth companies are the worst affected when a new technology comes around and disrupts them. Because that seems to be the usual trend. And it does make sense because You have sales-driven companies, not so easy to disrupt, but product-led companies, yeah, their core offering runs on those growth loops, and if those growth loops are disrupted in any way, then it's easy for the whole model to break down. And the other thing that this makes me think is when companies see PMF collapsing, is there any way to get it back? And I don't think so. I think, let me know what you think, but I think PMF is very unique and what's the word? It's delicate. Like once you lose PMF, you kind of have to rework to find a new PMF. You're never going back and getting to the same point in time where the same product is going to have like a very similar PMF.
Can you elaborate on that? Like,
But I think the idea is that each of these companies, when their PMF is collapsing, there's nothing that they can do to reverse it. At least reverse it in a way in which they can go back in time and things can be the way they were before. I mean, I get that if you were to sue all the companies using the new technology or they run into legal troubles and that new technology just kind of disappears, then that might be one case in which, yeah, you go back to the status quo that existed before. But I think in every other case, and it doesn't look like that's going to happen with AI. So it's essential that when companies see their PMF collapsing, they immediately have to start working towards a new PMF.
yeah, it's like Zapier is another example that comes to mind. So they are known for like their no-code workflows, and you would have to think about different workflows that you can create. So you can create rule-based workflows, and they required a bit of a learning curve. It was easier to learn than compared to writing code from scratch. It was a great no-code tool where you could have different building blocks. You can put them in any sequence that makes sense for them. You could repurpose those building blocks as needed, but it would give you an automated workflow where depending on a trigger, you will see a certain outcome. Now, with AI-driven automation, specifically with AI agents, what people were doing was, even we did that for a couple of weeks, we were like writing things in plain English and asking it to give us a workflow or give us a code. So that shift essentially is like going from building workflows, you can go and uh, to say a cursor, or now Zapier has their own AI agents, which they announced earlier this year. The idea is that you don't have to create workflows. You can just start with plain English, describe the workflows you want, and you have tools that will create these automated workflows for you. So I think that's essentially a shift that's happening. And if Zapier didn't have these agents, then like they would likely have a hard time selling their previous technology.
Yeah, and it makes me curious, are these bets paying off? Because they it seemed like they did pay off for a company like Shutterstock in their space. But the companies that are adopting AI workflows and AI agents, infusing them, do you think it's like too soon to tell, or are we seeing any early signs of benefits?
It's too soon to tell if they're paying off in terms of profitability or revenue gains. I believe they definitely have an advantage, or at least are competing in this space. I don't know if they have a competitive advantage because, as you know, there's a lot of similar tools available out there. We don't know which ones will persist and which ones won't, but just by being actively reacting to it, and then they're putting themselves in a better position compared to by not reacting.
Yeah, makes sense. It's probably going to take some time. And before we see any like results, things are going to change very quickly with the technology itself. So
Yeah.
it's going to be a long road for companies that are trying to use AI, and it's just changing every day and it's getting better. And you kind of have to keep up and make sure that you're preparing for how quickly these technologies are improving while building your current product.
Yeah, and the key takeaway is because you have adopted AI in some form. I don't believe that's the end state because the whole idea of PMF is it's not you do it once and then you forget about it because it's not a final destination. It's constantly a moving target, and I think it's moving faster today than ever in the past. So even if companies have reacted to it and adopted these technologies, and for now you can say they have maybe achieved PMF, I think we just have to continuously revalidate, reevaluate, and keep evolving with time, with technology, with changes in customer expectations. So the question that we all need to keep in mind and keep asking is like, hey, what signals tell us that our PMF is still good or is it starting to collapse?
Yeah. Should we use that as a good segue into what lessons we can learn from the way these companies have responded?
Yeah, I think for me the lesson is it's a moving target, and you gotta keep asking and keep evaluating. But I'm curious to hear what else is on your mind.
I think I'll take away quite a few lessons, and I alluded to some of them earlier. First of all, it's inevitable. AI is going to touch every company and every industry to some extent. Some industries probably more than others, some industries quicker than others, but it's coming for every single industry. And so there's no point resisting it. It's inevitable. And I think the other takeaway was when I read about how Getty Images responded to AI initially, I think I read some statements by someone in their company leadership, and he mentioned something which kind of felt like he was saying, just like Getty Images survived the smartphone revolution and professional stock photography is here to stay, and just like the smartphone cameras couldn't kill us, AI is also not going to disrupt us to that extent. Um, which I felt was a learning, and they were like quick to realize that and adjust. But the takeaway there is every revolution is different.
Yep.
The internet revolution was different, smartphone revolution was different, and the AI revolution was different. Each of it, I think, brings its own opportunities. But since these revolutions are inherently different in that the technology is going to disrupt your industry in different ways than other technologies have done in the past, it's important to not try to recycle strategies from the past. You have to create a whole new strategy, gather your data on what this technology is going to be, and then you have to envision a future with all the data that you've generated and create a strategy based on what's happening today and where you predict that it's going to go. So every revolution is different. You need to respond to it in different ways. It's best to frame it as an opportunity, even though it feels like a threat initially. If you hop on early and consider it not as a threat, but think of it in terms of an opportunity. And I like the designed thinking tactic here, which is when you're framing a problem into an opportunity, you think about how might we use this technology to improve our business and not let it disrupt us. So I think those were a few learnings related to just like seeing every revolution differently and trying to take it as an opportunity. The other, I think, obvious one is, and we just talked about it, is like you have to kind of skate to where the puck will be. Like you can't think about it in terms of what's this technology capable of today and let's use it and build a product. No, you have to see that it's constantly changing. So if you're going to start building something today, you want to kind of try to see the trajectory of the technology and where it's going to be in the future and kind of build something keeping the future capabilities in mind. So I think that's a pretty obvious one. But I think the one last learning for me was around the permanence of PMF collapse, and it's what I kind of talked about a little bit earlier. Is that yeah, if you see a PMF collapsing, you kind of have to quickly try to find a new one. It has to be done, like you said as well. You don't have enough time, especially with this AI revolution. You have less time than you probably did with previous disruptions, and so it's going to take a lot of effort to be able to quickly make your bets and find your new PMF. And that also reminded me of something I read in this book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. It's a pretty popular book on kind of navigating struggles within a company. And this portion of the book has really stuck with me where Ben says that essentially when you're in a crisis, you need to act fast. And so he suggests that think about what you would do if your company were to shut down today. And whatever you think you would do, you should do that today. You should do
Yep.
that now. So that one part of it has really stuck with me, and I was constantly reminded of that when reading about these examples of how companies are navigating this Gen AI disruption.
Yeah, the last piece reminds me of a quote I've heard, not sure where it's from. It's disrupt yourself instead of being disrupted. The idea you work towards disrupting your current offerings as opposed to another company disrupting you.
Yeah, I love that. Disrupt yourself before you get disrupted.
All right, we covered quite a bit. We went through a few examples, and the idea was not just to talk about a concept we read, but share real world examples or observations and hopefully leave people with enough pointers and enough questions to rethink about like the products that they're working on, the products that they're building.
Yeah, and an interesting thing would be to count the number of times we use the word AI during this episode.
Yeah, we can do that as part of our post production edits.
You want to have a bet that I think I used AI more than you?
I would agree, yeah, because you also went deep
Okay,
into like sharing an examples, but yeah, we can definitely
sure.
do a comparison.
Yeah, we'll count it up.
All right. Well, this was a good chat, like always, and I'll continue the tradition of over and out. Bye.